entity to take on the role of service delivery. Now, why might one want to do that? And at the end there's a slide about issues that it presents, so I'm certainly not presenting it as a panacea of all problems, but the rationale behind it is that it does allow efficiencies, or it can allow for efficiencies through commercial organisations coming in and looking to deliver things in a way that they have experienced and found to be more efficient than perhaps the public sector might have done. It also, and this is a central rationale certainly of the mutual agenda which we're talking about, it offers a different context for staff in terms of the service. It offers an opportunity for them to be engaged and have a sense of ownership and involvement in service that may be difficult within a much larger public sector organisation. So the overall hope for those that do decide to undertake this is that it will offer at least an equivalent level of service, but at a lower cost. And then for this slide, which is just reinforcing what I've said a couple of times around the different options that exist within this contracting out sphere. And on the next slide, I'll run through some examples to bring this to life. But there are very different options from the private sector through to contracting with entities that a public sector owns, and this almost middle ground of mutuals and social enterprises where it's not public sector, but it's not private sector in the sense of having private shareholders who ultimately want to derive value for their shares. And over recent years, we've seen increasing overlaps in how commissioners have sought to tackle this agenda. And rather than these being seen as mutually exclusive categories, we've seen commissioners go out and look to combine them. A good example, which actually isn't on the next slide, but I just mentioned, is the Cabinet Office. Actually, it's well thought. I didn't realise you were going to be here, but it's a Cabinet Office spin out that's happened recently that we were involved in around quite a small team of sort of quasi consultants that had been operating within the Cabinet Office called the Behavioural Insights Team, or the kind of Nudge Economics group, as it was more colloquially known. And there they've now arrived at a spin-out situation which involves a third sector party coming in as a shareholder, jointly owned with the Cabinet Office and jointly owned with members of the team that are going over. So, a recent and quite high-profile example that actually includes all of those elements. So, for people who are thinking about this, I suppose the main message I want to leave is not to think of them as alternatives, and there is lots of scope to have a tailored solution that picks different elements. In terms of examples from other areas, there are quite a lot when you look across the public sector, as one would expect, I suppose, given the way public services as a whole has gone over the last decade. What we are seeing now, and all of these I'm talking about frontline service delivery rather than outsourcing of back office services to make an organisation more efficient. So all of this is about public services that a public body has a responsibility to deliver and looking to give it to someone else. And as you'll see, these are starting to move, in the more recent examples, to quite sensitive, and in some cases very sensitive, areas of public service where the public sector rightly will be very, very, very focused on ensuring that, quite apart from any efficiencies that may be achieved, there are certain standards in terms of how the services are conducted and the risk that it presents that must be met. And here we've got children's social services being moved out in Kingston and Richmond, where it's moving to a jointly owned company that they're going to contract with to deliver the service. And you might have also seen that's something that Doncaster is looking to do. In health, we have some now very very broad contracts going out. The Cambridgeshire one is a contract to deal with all of the care needs of the older population in that area, which is going to involve whoever is successful in that contract working with a number of different organisations to provide everything from acute to community to end of life, all those services and anything else that someone within the over 65 groups might need in Cambridgeshire will now be delivered by an outside organisation. So we're starting to see real frontline services that maybe a few years ago we would have thought were beyond or would not have been appropriate for a contracting out approach are now being contracted out. And then lastly, a good one to mention, the work around the probation services that's going on at the moment, with some obvious analogies where it's a statutory service, and there that has been run as a national programme that's looking to appoint bidders from a range of areas, including mutuals emerging from the probation trusts. And this has been probably the most successful area of government policy to date in terms of generating interest in sort of real prospective mutuals, and there are a number of probation trusts very actively bidding as part of that to be involved in what will be an outsourced service from Secretary of State for Justice to deliver probation services. So those are some areas where things are happening in this space already. In terms of the legal framework for fire, at the moment there are certain limitations on what a fire authority may choose to contract out, in particular around those emergency activities. And whilst that means that there is scope to contract out for quite a range of activity and in terms of actual activity that happens, a sizable amount of the service, the emergency activities as things stand would not be something that could be contracted out. So what does that leave as the fire sector? What does that leave you with? Well, there's the option of contracting out in a traditional way within the legislative parameters, so that is excluding the emergency service element, and so as part of that you would be very open to considering whether a mutual or a social enterprise could be the entity that you contract with, of course, again subject to those limitations. It might be, and this is something that we've seen a lot certainly in local government, that as an interim step to exploring a possibly longer term aim of having a pure contractual relationship with a independent provider, local authorities have set up wholly owned companies that they move a service to, and the Cheshire Adult Social Services one that was on the previous slide is a good example of this, where the service is moved to this new entity and run on a quasi-independent basis, with the public sector commissioner acting on the end of a contract rather than running it as part of its organisation, but with the safety and the comfort factor of knowing that it is still owned by the commissioner, and so if things do not work out as they might be hoping, there's the option of taking it back in and continuing or looking at it for afresh. If, however, it proves after, say, 2 or 3 years that it has been an arrangement that has worked, and that has been something that's offered something new to the service and something new to the commissioner, it could be that the ownership transfers away from the public sector to individuals, staff, the mutual scenario, or other organisations. So that is something that's been very successfully adopted in local government, and something that has allowed change to happen without it happening in a big bang way. And then lastly, in terms of arriving at a more complete contracting out situation, where there isn't any retained function in relation to emergency services, it would be a question of legislative change. And the last slide is just some key issues, and I said earlier, when talking about the rationale, that it's certainly not a approach that does not have risks or considerations to take into account. And these are some of the issues that are typically key when we've been involved in projects, and accountability, understandably, at the top there, in terms of how is the Commissioner, who is going to continue to be legally accountable for the service and the standard of the service, and indeed, in your situation, democratically accountable as well as legally. So there needs to be a situation where the Commissioner feels that they continue to have an appropriate level of control over what is happening, and that they've got appropriate levers to use in the event that things are not happening as they should be. And then linked in with that, of course, is standards, and making sure that as part of that the service continues to operate at least at the level that it needs to from a legal perspective. Just moving over to governance, I think we've sort of discussed a bit. Yeah, and into the last moments. I suppose if I was going to mention two other things that have been so key in many of these projects, it's staff, both positively in terms of how can new models, in particular around mutuals and public ownership models, how can that offer opportunities to staff to become engaged in the service in a way they haven't perhaps had opportunities before, and pensions in terms of the cost of moving out of the existing pensions arrangement potentially into a new one, which can be very significant. And then lastly, procurement rules, which can present issues if a Commissioner would like to go with a specific organisation. For example, if there is a new independent mutual and the Commissioner would like to contract with that organisation but not with anyone else, how that fits with the requirements around open tendering is another issue that is commonly encountered. And that very quickly, I think we're dealing with questions at the end.
Questions at the end.
Yeah. Thank you.